Until Dawn is an interactive horror game released in 2015 that follows 8 high school students trapped on a mountain while a mysterious man called the Psycho hunts them down. They find out the Psycho is actually one of their friends, Josh, who's pulling an elaborate revenge prank because 2 of his sisters went missing last year on the same trip after one of them was pranked. While all this is happening, there are actual monsters, Wendigos, who are hunting down the students. After being split up for various reasons, they regroup at the cabin that they started at and end the game by blowing up the cabin with all the Wendigos inside. The game has heavy inspirations from both horror films and video games, drawing slasher tropes such as stalking scenes from Halloween, a mysterious masked psycho from Friday the 13th, and elaborate murder traps and being forced to choose life or death from Saw. It also features fixed camera angles seen in the original Resident Evil, as well as a similar setting of a cabin on a mountain during the winter. There are also the Telltale games that feature a narrative focus with decision-making, quick-time events, and variable story. I hesitate to say that it has inspiration from Telltale games because the development windows are very close to another. The Walking Dead was released in 2013 and Until Dawn was in development since 2010, but they do share many mechanics and both are prominent in the narrative-based choices matter genre. Different sections of the game rely heavily on different tropes, but what makes Until Dawn stand out is the subversion of these tropes by combining them together. The game goes from slasher film to Saw film to supernatural horror, while keeping narrative threads within these. The game features a narrative mechanic called the butterfly effect, where players' decisions will affect the narrative. Some of these are inconsequential, but others determine life or death. For example, at one point, Chris has to choose between sacrificing himself or Ashley, or they'll both die. Their decision doesn't really matter in the moment because neither of them will die in the scene, but if Chris tried to sacrifice Ashley, she'll hesitate in opening a door to save Chris later on, and it'll lead to his death. Oftentimes the decisions made will have like totally knowable or unknowable unforeseen consequences that'll kill off a character, and part of the design intention here is that the game is meant to be played like several times where like you'll know that a certain decision will lead to a death. There are also QuickTime events that'll more directly determine a character's success in a given action scene. And there are also, there's another mechanic called the don't move sequences, where the player has to hold the controller still in order to succeed at whatever they're trying to do. This mechanic really escalates quickly because the first 2 are about like feeding a squirrel and focusing a light on like a power box, but then like every subsequent one is usually like hiding from someone, and if you fail, it means death or capture for the character. And we'll go more in depth into this later. Also, both of these mechanics do have accessibility issues, with QuickTime events and don't move sequences being difficult for many. Until Dawn like fails to provide accessible settings for these mechanics, but the company Supermassive Games, which made Until Dawn, their newer games, which have a similar sort of gameplay, do have more accessibility options. I think that game should be playable by everyone regardless of whether or not they can like pass a stupid QuickTime event. So yeah. The game got a lot of criticism for having large stretches where the player doesn't do anything, and criticisms in a similar vein that your choices for the first half of the game don't really matter. I think, however, that both of these criticisms are actually like some of the bigger strengths of the game. They create tension and player engagement and are necessary for the narrative. The game follows a classic story arc with escalating crises up until the climax of the game. And I think the climax is when Josh is revealed to be the Psycho. After this, like you understand the whole like saw trap murder thingy that he's been doing, but then like the present danger of the Wendigos is also revealed. That is like the real danger to them. I think the strongest aspect of Until Dawn is the narrative focus, and in order for this like narrative focus and story arc to work, the player can't be able to like derail the plot before it begins. So like if you could just avoid like the whole Josh plot or like take him out, then the buildup in the arc would be impossible. So like to get the payoff of the Wendigo plotline, you have to limit player choice to the scope that it is. A few sections that explain why I think the inaction and lack of player choice are actually really important. The first one is the Saw section.
Live or die. Make your choice.
Chris, are you there?
Hello, and thank you all for joining me.
Wake up!
Tonight, we're going to conduct a little experiment, sort of test. Now for this experiment, we'll need the cooperation of our 2 test subjects, Joshua and Ashley.
What?
As you just saw, there's like a set of scenes in this game that are all like this, where like they take heavy influence from the Saw movies. For those of you who haven't seen them, within the Saw films, there's like often characters have to make like a choice to save one person or the other, but very often the choice is misleading or doesn't matter. and it'll like kill the person that like you wanted to save or vice versa. This exact same illusion of choice is present in these scenes in Until Dawn, and no matter what you choose, for example, Josh will die in that scene. And in the subsequent scene that comes afterwards, neither Chris nor Ashley will die there. But the game takes the whole like, oh, it's Saw, and like, you know, your choices don't matter, someone's gonna die no matter what you do, and turns it on his head. Although your choices don't matter in this scene, the fate of Chris depends entirely on whether or not you choose to sacrifice himself or whether he chooses to sacrifice Ashley. These early sequences, although they don't drastically alter the plot at the moment, do provide critical character connections for later on.
Ash, come on, this thing is right behind me, please, let me in. Ash, what are you doing?
Hey, listen!
These early scenes and choices also function as a tutorial of sorts. By allowing the player to see the cause and effect of their actions, they understand the gameplay ramifications of these moments, without giving serious consequences to the player early on. Because the butterfly effect system was a relatively novel concept in 2013, giving players the space to play around with it is necessary. Just as Soma has a sequence early on where there's no danger, and you can just walk around the room and explore the limits of the controls, we get the same thing in Until Dawn. It just looks a little bit different. The ways that we interact with the world are very different too. After Josh reveals he's the psycho though, the game stops holding your hand. After this point, most failures to act, whether intentional or accidental, by like failing a QuickTime event, are going to kill the character. You can see this sort of as like leaving the tutorial and learning that like your actions do in fact matter. There are also these sequences in which you're instructed to like not move. It says like don't move ! And gives a little indicator of like controller movement. And if you move the controller too much, then you'll fail the sequence and something bad will happen. These aren't really a new concept in horror games or horror movies. Like even in an early game like Resident Evil 2, which is a game that's like defined by constantly having to be moving and running away from zombies. There are these enemies called lickers, which you can avoid completely if you stand still. Basically every horror film also has a sequence where like someone tries to hide by staying completely still and being dead silent. So this isn't really a new concept in any capacity. And to top it all off, Until Dawn is a game where you spend a lot of time like not using your controller to interface with the game. So with all this, like why include this mechanic? Is it worth anything? I think so. It's in my opinion one of the best conceptual mechanics in the game. Again, quick note though, like there are accessibility issues with this, so I'm hesitant to call it the best mechanic design, but I think the idea behind it is really solid. Most other games are really input centered, which means that your avatar moves when you tell it to and doesn't when you don't input anything. Going back to our example of Resident Evil 2, Jill or Leon, whichever main character you're playing as, moves how you tell them to, when you tell them to. Sure, there are cutscenes, but as far as gameplay goes, it's direct control. Not triggering a licker, for example, requires you to just not touch the controller, like you just don't input anything. Although mechanically simple, this moment is tense because it requires you to do something very different from the rest of the game. Like, instead of moving, you have to stand still. Until Dawn, however, can't really do the same thing because so much of the game doesn't require input. Like, there are a lot of like cutscenes and a lot of things where you aren't actually like inputting any sort of controls. So for these, instead of not doing anything, you specifically have to do nothing. You have to very deliberately sit there without moving a muscle for a pretty long period of time. By doing so, the game's drawing you into the character's perspective, making you mimic their standing still. Just as the licker makes you reevaluate the actions you take without second thought before, the don't move sections force you to suddenly pay very close attention to your physical interaction with the controller, where you can usually ignore it. In the last chapter, the sections with the most don't move sections, they last for 15 seconds each. And 15 seconds is a long time to stand still. It's really hard to stand still, especially when that nasty thing's screeching at you. These high-stress moments trigger our flight or fight responses, which makes it very hard to stand still. Although we're only being asked to hold a controller still, our immediate physical response makes it difficult to do so. Being a character-driven game, any opportunity to make you really connect with a character in Until Dawn is crucial. It's these moments that make the game good. They have the highest stakes, the most tension, and are challenging even though the game is not demanding that much of you. Now you might be saying, why does this matter? Sure, holding a controller still is hard when I'm getting yelled at, but why should I care? As I said before, I think video games historically have been defined by their action and direct mechanical interactivity. By looking at games like Until Dawn that break that formula, that create new experiences, we get more players. People who might not be interested in that direct control, or people who want a more cinematic experience. Or it's a game that's easier for several people to play at once. Not only that, but we also get better stories and different ways of understanding the human experience.